I'm only arguing that from the perspective of the Aztecs, the idea of human sacrifice was an empirically justifiable one. They already believed that showing glory to the gods would bring them bounty. So a human sacrifice...
Wait, what do you think empirical is?
Because they thought the gods were an empirical force in the world. If you presuppose that the gods exist empirically, as in they can affect the world, they believe the gods are a material force in the world. And if you presuppose that,
I don't, as polytheists, we generally hold that the non-physicalness is an aspect
I'm pretty sure
as part of
the Aztecs did believe that the gods
Aztecs were not physicalists, and regardless, as far as the Aztecs being, we can take it to another. Let's move from the Aztecs to
no,
the
but I
history
haven't
of
finished the
Hold
point
on,
yet.
1 second.
Wait,
1 second.
but you can't 1 second me. I have to 1 second you.
You can still talk about human sacrifice. I just want to move it to a religion I'm more familiar with. We can talk about the history of my own religion, which has human sacrifice in it, and we can discuss it from there. It's just I want to move it out of like out of that conversation into one that I have a little bit more familiarity with, but still has the same problem, so that we can discuss it substantively.
Okay.
All right, go ahead. So heathens in the past did human sacrifices to Odin. Yes, we agree on that. So go ahead and make your point.
Okay. If they believe that the gods are a material force in the world, which they did, even if they didn't believe the gods would show up and fuck them physically, but they did believe that. I know, it was Odin and Thor. They fucked
You had some euhemerus beliefs with history, yeah. They've got Snorri talking about how Freyr is part of the royal family of Sweden, or whatever.
Literally thought, like, in the world.
It's a Christian's record, but, anyway, whatever. Go ahead.
They thought, even if they were just metaphysical forces, Thor being lightning would mean that he could affect the world materially. And if you believe those things, if that's a material belief that you hold, unerringly, people would be executed for heresy. I mean, you have to believe this to varying extents. It is not irrational. It is purely logical to then go, yeah, human sacrifices to honor the gods are a good thing. That's a correct argument if you presuppose the existence of those gods. And that's what makes the religious angle
You can have
really
the existence of the gods, and you can even hold that human sacrifice is effective or whatever. Not my position, but let's talk about it. You can still at that point hold a pluralist position and say, regardless of whatever effect human sacrifice has, regardless of it, it's still not a preferable position or preferable practice to have because of the harm associated with it. Doesn't matter.
It
if the gods are asking
matters.
you to do things that are unethical, then fuck that shit.
Right?
Like that's easy enough to convince somebody to do. If the gods are asking you to harm people that are your friends, there's no reason to actually listen to that shit.
But they thought the gods would raise their villages. The pagans didn't believe that the gods were necessarily the arbiters of morality, but they did believe they'd be punished for not showing due deference to the gods. So if you can do a human sacrifice to keep your village from being raised.
This gets into a misunderstanding of history with respect to pagan belief, where it's like, well, they worship the gods because they were afraid of them on some level. This is not what we see bearing out in history when we read these people actually discussing their own religions. Usually what's going on is that we see people that are giving sacrifice and engaging in a system of reciprocity, gifts for a gift, that the gods give gifts and they give gifts in return. It's not like, oh, well, we didn't sacrifice to the gods, therefore we're going to be experiencing a tsunami tomorrow or some shit, or that human sacrifices were not participated in or whatever. Like, this is getting into highly superstitious beliefs, which we have records of people in history bitching about and saying, this is a terrible practice. Stop fucking doing it because of the consequences of it.
There would be consequences for not venerating the gods and benefits to venerating the gods. That's pretty common across all
the consequence to human sacrifice is dead humans.
Dead humans happen all the time. You lose humans sending them out on hunting expeditions, but you execute one for the sake of keeping the god from raising your village or ending a drought. That's an ethical argument that lands in your favor. Ethically, if you send a group of people out in a hunting party or a raiding party, we're talking about Vikings here after all, you're far more likely to get more death for less gain than maintaining a studious and reverent relationship with your deities. So human sacrifice is a logical thing to do under
But we
those
see also in history that if the gods do not receive sacrifice, that the substantive damages that happen is not necessarily that kind of severe.
If
people have been Christian for a long time, and especially now, right? Like if we're gonna be talking about religiosity now with the arguments that we have access to, and not just what people think are possible religions that exist. You know what I mean? Because I think that what you're talking about is like, well, if we have a possibility of this religion in which we can possibly come to that conclusion, all that kind of stuff. This is where we get into the religion analogy or the politics analogy really quickly, that you can have people that are organized by atheistically, fascistically, and the problem there is going to be the authoritarianism. The problem with what you're talking about is the authoritarian aspect, not necessarily just mere God belief at that point. It's the reasoning
process. It's the belief in anything spiritual that does this. It's not the authoritarian aspect. If you believe that there's a God, wait, please. If you believe there's a literal God that dictates the reins and that it's represented by a capricious woman, and that glory to that woman in the form of sacrifice will bring the rains and end the drought, that all of the predicating beliefs, all of the material assumptions about the nature of rain and that God, now you have a logical argument for human sacrifice. That's not about authoritarianism.
You can come up with a logical argument for inhumane shit all the fucking time. The thing that I'm saying, and the point, one second, the point of this discussion of which I'm trying to do is not necessarily argue that in any religious construction, you're going to be able to get entirely, moral people or moral beliefs in any subset. I don't think that that's something you can say about any set of beliefs. You have, when you get into an extremism or fundamentalism representation of any religion, you wind up with these serious problems. And that goes true for any ideology in general, beyond the spiritual shit.
No, wait, I can't let you get away with that.
You get extremist? What do you mean?
You can't equivocate this to extremist political systems. My arguments aren't against extreme religion. I'm arguing against the very concept of making statements about the material world based on metaphysical presumptions. It has nothing to do with how extreme.
But we've already agreed that metaphysical presumptions can be made with effect, right? Like that, in order to study history, in order to study logic, in order to even to get anywhere in theology, in order to get anywhere with logic in the first place, you're going to need to make some metaphysical assumptions. In order to engage with the external world, you need to make metaphysical assumptions.
Outside of the basic ones for engaging with the world, that's not the same as also believing in deities that control the rain. There are basic
if you want to explore spiritually, there's certain
assumptions
you're going to make. Just like if you want to explore history, there's going to be certain assumptions you're going to make.
You want to
explore mathematics,
you do not have to make any metaphysical assumptions to understand history at all. You don't have to. You can keep that entirely within the material world. The metaphysics in our case are just bridging consciousness gaps. But you don't need to then go, okay, because we have to bridge the consciousness gap, therefore it's okay to believe in fucking Odin. Like you can't jump that and then run to any metaphysical argument.
You have different arguments with respect to deities, right? Like, so with polytheism, arguments are going to be related to personal experience, the diversity of personal experiences, and then at that point you're going to be getting into some form of polytheism. That's the general steps that you're going to be able to get there. And people are going to continue to have spiritual experiences. People are going to continue to explore spirituality on the basis of those assumptions. It's something that you agreed earlier in this conversation we're just going to have to deal with. So from that perspective, how do you deal with that socially? And that's where I'm saying pluralism is preferable to anti-theism.
Well, no,
because anti-theism, in my opinion, is just another supremacy narrative at the end of the day.
People are going to have experiences that make them racist or sexist because we have tribal instincts like buried deep in our lizard brains that cause us to make
I'm not saying trust
assumptions.
Every experience, right?
Okay, so even though humans are going to keep having tribalistic biases ingrained into their brains, I think you should still principally fight against that type of behavior.
What the problem is, and articulate what the actual issue is at the end of the day. And that's where I'm saying all the examples that you're bringing up are extremist fundamentalist expressions of religion.
No, they're not. I talked about horoscopes. That's not an extremist fundamentalist aspect of religion.
And horoscopes, we can probably agree, can be practiced without anybody dying in the process.
I don't care if people die.
You make a point with respect to horoscopes where it talks about essentializing people. And on that, I agree with you on. And I think I've said as much in the past. But I don't think that when you're looking at practices in general, you should be looking at them under the auspices of what harm they cause, and then making a judgment call on that effect. Because people, again, are going to be religious. People are going to continue exploring religiosity.
If we want to talk about the harm religion is causing right now, then you're going to have to wait for fundamentalist Christians to die off. Because if we're talking about immediate empirical harm,
we need to be able to criticize fundamentalist Christians without attacking our allies, right?
That's
why I'm saying pluralism is the way to go.
There are allies who have toxic masculine tendencies. You can still target toxic masculinity while being like you're jumping between like spiritual critiques and ethical positions and like the pragmatics of coalition building.
The spiritual critiques that you're making and the spiritual critiques that I think that are a good system to go under are both ethical considerations, right? Unless you think that human sacrifice is bad for some reason other than ethical reasons.
I think that it's bad for ethical reasons unless you believe that there's a God who will end a drought in which case I think it's ethically good to do, because you've now established supernatural.
That's just a bad argument.
It's not.
At
Wait,
that point, no. If you're going
Wait,
to
how is
say
that
that human
bad?
sacrifice is ethical under certain considerations,
Wait, wait. Especially
Why?
back in those days, we sacrificed people all the time to go on hunting trips, to go on expeditions, to go gather resources. All the
Right.
time they lost people. If you could end a drought that's plaguing a country of millions with a human sacrifice, that is an incredibly straightforward ethical assumption for that time period. Yeah.
And in this time period, that is an extremist notion. Right?
There are places in the world right now that are suffering from drought. What if you could, like in West Africa, end malaria with a human sacrifice?
Can it be done?
Well, I'm not religious, so no.
Right.
But if a person believed that it could be done,
that's not an expression of religion that I would be holding to. I think that if you're going to be engaging in harmful practices, it should not be done.
But if
harmful practice is bad,
if you
right,
believe
and we can
it
make
could be
criticisms
done,
of religions on the basis of their harmful practices,
you would be saving hundreds of thousands of lives. If you believed it could be done, would you agree it's an ethically right thing to do? Like, hey, does anyone volunteer in the entirety of West Africa? One person is willing to lay themselves down on the table? Like,
I'm not interested in getting convinced into some sort of human sacrifice notion.
Wait, wouldn't
it's not
you
something that I would hold.
If you believed that malaria, the biggest killer of humans, next to like cancer or whatever, could be ended with one sacrifice.
My chat's kind of pointing this out. This is consequentialist thinking.
I am a consequentialist.
If that would be a big difference between us then, because I think
that's another problem.
The action that is ethically wrong is not going to be the best approach in order to actually deal with a problem like this.
But it wouldn't be an action that's ethically wrong. The consequences of it would be good. Therefore, it would be an ethically good action.
This is the problem with consequentialism, not a problem with religious thinking.
No, this is very basic religious thinking right here.
This is your position, not mine at this point. That you're saying that if you held religiosity and were a consequentialist, this would be the result, right?
If you believe
this is a problem with consequentialism,
that malaria could be ended with that, you would then say, no, malaria should continue. Hundreds of thousands should die every year. Not one person should be allowed to volunteer for sacrifice.
If you have that situation as a reality, then you're going to find like a couple of consequentialists that are probably going to be engaging with that on a consensual basis between each other. And then the problem does whatever it does. But that does not mean that I'm necessarily going to be condoning it, because I'm not a fucking consequentialist at the end of the day. I believe that if you're going to be having practices that are harmful, then you need to be criticizing those practices on the basis of harm.
But not addressing malaria would be harmful.
They can be. Sorry, I misspoke. These practices can be criticized on the basis of their harm, right?
Like allowing malaria to continue, which would be the consequence of not allowing somebody to be sacrificed.
Is the religious practice is not doing something a practice?
I'm sorry?
Is not doing something a practice?
Wait, absolutely. You're absolutely responsible for what happens if you choose not to do something. Yes. Okay.
Then sure. And that can be like a large ethical conversation. But I think that at that point, you're going to want to talk about how effective those practices are going to be.
Well, hundreds of thousands of people.
At that point, if this situation arises, what is going to be your position? Do you hold that we should do the human sacrifice at that point?
To save hundreds? Yeah, absolutely. That's the best.
And then that would be your position. Ratio. I'm not necessarily of that position because of the harmful practice aspect. Because then we're opening the door to doing human sacrifice for all kinds of stuff. We're building a cultural narrative and to getting into human sacrifice as a regular practice generally.
We do this with military.
That's something that is going to be creating a superstitious angle, and I'm not into that.
We sacrifice our soldiers so that they can affect good geopolitical outcomes. World War II, we made the decision tens of thousands of our soldiers can die because it's better.
That's a little bit different of a fight is a different practice than killing them yourself.
Blood is the only relevant human currency when it comes to great actions that are recorded in history books, I'm afraid. No matter what you choose, yes, no, abstemiousness or not, people are going to get hurt.
But you're going to also agree that some of those actions are unethical. You can make an unethical action and have beneficial consequences from it. This is ends justify the means, and we see that throughout history too. That doesn't mean it's something we ought do.
Well, that's consequentialism, if the ends do justify the means.
And that's where a big difference between us. Let me try and make this argument in a way to appeal to consequentialism, though. So if you're wanting to engage in a way that is going to create change, you're going to want to get as many people on your side as possible.
No, I don't want to get to the coalition building part.
You're going to be wanting to engage in a pluralist standard rather than an anti-theist standard.
I believe in reaching out to guys who have toxic masculine aspects, but I'll still sit on here and argue that toxic masculinity is bad for 7 hours straight. This isn't.
Sure.
I'm not pitching this to a crowd right now. I'm just talking about my basic beliefs about what types of thoughts are good, what's structured well. I'm not making like the case for like the pan-religious like socialist union of America or whatever. If I was, then I wouldn't talk about any of this because I don't think I can convince anyone or affect any positive change, like while pitching it there behind the podium. But right here, while talking about the basics.
If you're going to hold a position that is anti-theist, then when you're expressing it on your channel, you're engaging in political action.
I talk about toxic masculinity on my channel, but I still want guys to have those tendencies.
And that's good. So do I. I've got a video on toxic masculinity as well. So we're on the same page with respect to that.
Well, yeah, so we agree.
I think that we would agree that toxic masculinity is in all cases bad, right?
Well, if it's toxic masculinity, by definition, it has to be bad because it's toxic.
So we can also talk about toxic religiosity, right?
Well, I would just think religiosity is toxic religiosity.
Right. And so
I don't think there's a good one.
I think that with masculinity, you can have beneficial expressions of masculinity and you can have beneficial expressions of religiosity. We can can separate these issues by saying we're not demonizing masculinity. We're talking about toxic masculinity, and we're not demonizing religiosity. We're talking about toxic religiosity.
I am demonizing,
and that's the criticisms that were being made by Plutarch and Theophrastus in the past. They were talking about toxic expressions of religiosity.
But I am talking about all religiosity. It's not about the outcomes. It's the thought process for me.
So there's no beneficial religiosity to you.
Everything that can be done from religiosity that is good can be done through secular means. And even if that wasn't the case, I would still be against religiosity.